Good evening, everyone, and thank you very much for joining us tonight for the RIAS Awards in Detail event. Thank you for coming along and kind of viewing the projects on show this evening and getting the opportunity to ask questions about these two fantastic award-winning projects. This is a part of a series of 4 events that is allowing RIAS members to hear directly from the practices and architects about their projects. You know, we're always used to reading about them in journals and magazines, so it's great to have that opportunity to interact with those that put them together and obviously have a conversation about them afterwards. And we're really lucky this evening to be joined by Neil Gillespie and Mark Dawson from Reiach and Hall to talk about Forth Valley College, the Falkirk Campus, and also Alan Garland from Stallan-Brand to tell us a bit more about Jedburgh Grammar Campus, both RIAS Awards winners and 2 very worthy educational buildings, which we've grouped together to kind of give a focus for tonight's talk on education, further education, and where the kind of procurement of education buildings is going in Scotland at the moment. Both projects, as I mentioned, were given RIAS awards this year, and I was just saying to those in the room that I was really lucky to visit both of these buildings. I feel very privileged position to be introducing this talk this evening. For those who don't know me, my name is Christina Gaiger and I'm the past president of the RIAS and very much enjoying that past status at the moment, although it's only been a month, so taking a bit of time to kind of take my foot off the pedal a little bit. So you don't want to hear from me this evening. I'm going to hand over straight away to Neil and Mark, and then over to Alan afterwards. We've got about 20 minutes for each presentation on the project. Please feel free to use the Q&A function during the presentations. I'll keep an eye on those, and once we've heard from both parties at the end, I'll kind of come back and review those questions. But please feel free to kind of put them in throughout the event so that we can kind of group them up as we're going, essentially. So over to you, Neil and Mark.
Hi, thanks, Christina. Absolutely delighted to be speaking this evening about Forth Valley. Mark and I are going to do a little bit of a double act, hopefully. I've been given the introduction, which I'll try and do very, very quickly because we don't have a great deal of time. First thing to say, obviously, as everyone does say, is that a building of this scale is the work of many, many people. So we'd like to just first of all acknowledge our design team and our delivery partners, KP Design. And the first thing I would like to stress is Forth Valley College as a client. We're fantastic. I can say that. There'll be no one on the line anyway listening to us. But over 15 years, we've been working with them over three campuses, and their ambition for their students and staff is commendable. It's really fantastic, and I think that's what's really driven us over these years to try and produce the best we could for them. So Forth Valley College, first point I'd like to make. The next slide, please, Mark. Really, context for us is everything, and our practice goes back to the 60s, even before that. And this building, Easter Bush Veterinary Field Station, 1962, Alan Reiach and Eric Holm partners. You'll see immediately the synergy, the connection from Forth Valley back to that time. We relish that kind of soft Scandinavian modernism, that emphasis on clarity of plan, simplicity of idea, the use of natural materials, and really a kind of attitude that's about a kind of common sense. Alan Reiach was very, very keen to use that phrase consistently through my time early in the office. Did it make sense? And I think that modernism, if we go to the next slide, Mark, continues to the present day. We see it as a continuity. We think there's still tremendous mileage in that particular kind of modernism, albeit along the way we've added more elements or more layers to that. Our Maggies, for example, introduced perforation, the introduction of the light catcher, we called it, in the courtyard. You'll see references to that within Forth Valley. So we're talking about an architecture that is based on our own heritage and our own history, and that connection back to a 1960s modernism, particularly Scandinavian. Next one, Mark. And we're also fascinated and inspired by the Scottish landscape, and particularly Forth Valley College and the River Forth, and that floodplain, and the three campuses that we were involved in, beginning with Alloa, then Stirling, and finally with Falkirk, the largest of the three. And that sense of geography, if we go to the next slide, Mark, hopefully, is about a floodplain, and that horizontal and that kind of essential mud, you know, the idea of an estuary, and particularly the Forth, that's the River Carron at the Kelpies coming in from about 1954, that image on the left, coming into the Forth. But the image on the right introduces another aspect, which is you've got Langanip Power Station now no more in the centre of the image, and to the right, Grangemouth. And this idea of Forth Valley being the host or the scene of a lot of industrial output in Scotland takes us to an idea. And Mark unearthed these areas are called the skin flats, which doesn't sound too promising, I don't think. But originally that has come from the Dutch Schoonplaats, meaning handsome place. So there was this connection to the Low Countries from Scotland at this point. So that idea of connection to mainland Europe, to Scandinavia, to this idea of mud and landscape led us to the next slide, please, Mark, on many of our buildings, to be interested in the idea of a material made from that mud, that essential mud brick. And the brick that we've been using on a number of our projects is a Danish product. So there is that connection back to Scandinavia, but there is a procurement issue here, is that, which we maybe get into in questioning, is this loss of connection with making. And the reason we use a lot of brick in our projects is a brick wall still has to be built. It can't be assembled. It still needs someone with skill to put it together. And it's made, in this case, the Peterson bricks by hand. So that there's a connection there between geography, between culture and materiality and procurement. How do we get through this process and get something that's got some quality to it? Next one, I'll speed up. And these are the three campuses, a figure ground of each of them. Alloa starting as the smallest, through to Stirling. Alloa on a slightly, there was more topography, I think, to deal with in Alloa. Stirling right on the Carse, right on the river, and Falkirk, a much bigger building, which generated a different attitude altogether. Next one, please. And just a quick image of Alloa, and immediately you'll see the connection back to that Bush Estate building in 1962, the Pilotti in the very simple form. In this case, the library looking out over back to the Ochil Hills right across the valley. And the next one, to give you just a flavour of the other two campuses, this is Stirling, sitting right on the river. The bottom left image, you'll see the Wallace Monument and the river sitting there. So this series of creating a series of terraces or platforms on which we can inhabit and we can build a college. So the first act, I think, of any architectural input is to make a platform from which we can then start to live or dwell. Next one, please, Mark, and I'll go through this quickly. This is an aerial view of the Falkirk site prior to development, and the site in the middle is the Middlefield site. The next slide shows you the building prior to us working. And there could be an interesting discussion here. Had we been revisiting this project now, would we retain the existing building? At the time, the ability to keep the college going and build a new college prevented that. But there may be a more robust discussion now. And again, this image is from 1962, so we had a real fondness of the existing building. And hence, moving into the new one, we've brought some of that with us. Next slide, Mark. And we'll go through the diagrams quickly. So there was a competition for this one. And the first scheme, next slide, please. I know we have to move quickly. Was a more ambitious scheme than the one that we built. In actual fact, it had a theatre in it, Falkirk Theatre, but probably correctly that there's thought of that project should remain within the centre of the town rather than out on the edge. But it it did have a more exuberant gestural aspect to it in that first iteration. Next slide, Mark. So there's the site, Falkirk Centre to the left and bottom. Falkirk Grahamstown line you can see running through there. I can probably mark that kind of. So that's Falkirk Grahamstown here. And the site to the, I think the slides, the following slides will help us. The M9 heading north, and the Kelpies. We'll show that in a second. Next slide, please, Mark. That's showing the M9, the A9, Forth and Union Canal to the north. Next slide. And from that, there is a sort of sense, this flat open view through to the Kelpies and back to the town centre itself, this diagrammatic sense. And the football stadium is immediately to the east of the site. Next one. And an industrial area, a lot of industrial. So this is giving you a sort of sense of scale. So we're sort of 10, 15 minutes from the centre of Falkirk to the south and west. Next one. And the site really developed, there was a master plan that was developed from the Helix project through Gateway site, which are potential future sites. The Forth Valley College sitting in the centre of that, where the existing college is in that light purple colour would be demolished and future housing there. A connection to Victoria Park, so that the next move, next slide please, is to connect the Helix project through the Forth Valley College site to Victoria Park and onwards to the shopping centre and to the centre of Falkirk. And you can see the football stadium to the, and the site is split very, very simply, bringing the yellow part, which is the site, forward to address the A9, with parking to the north. Next slide. Try to get through this quickly. So we split it very simply. Number 2 is the staff and student parking, which is the beginning of a route through the building from the north. Visitors parking is number 1 and enters from the south. Next slide. Along with where the visitors parking is bicycle park and public transport brought onto the site. Next slide. And the building itself, Mark is going to explain this in more detail, but there's really three basic components to it. The grey is a workshop building. A kind of brownie colour is the sports and community spaces. And the multicolour building is a kind of what we used to call a linear matrix, but it's a series of legs round the courtyards. And you'll see that in our Stobhill Hospital, in our Inverness Justice Centre, the sense of bringing daylight and amenity to the centre of the building through a series of courtyards. And the green represents the dining areas and flexible spaces. But on the next slide, what that means is that the building, as it addresses the town, also allows the community to access the building out of hours. So that coloured area involves all the shared and flexible spaces which relate to the town, and the college specialist spaces run to the north towards the staff and student entrance. Next slide, please, Mark. I'm taking up too much time here. And then the service yard sits between the 3 of them, giving access to all 3 of them. And it's a separate, secure access from the A9. Plant strategy on the roof that Mark will touch on later. Next slide. I think we go, and this is this Victoria Park connection through Helix to Victoria Park via the college was a really critical move through the site. Next slide. And that gives you just a little bit of sense of that interface between the college and the A9 and how it presents itself, the communal spaces. But the landscape by Horn and McLennan, we think is really beautiful, really successful. And it brings this palette of brick, precast concrete, ribbed aluminium, together with a really very subtle, next slide please, colour palette that the landscape brings. So the landscape colour is calling out the Forth Valley logo, in fact, but it's the silvery colour which works incredibly well, we think, with that Danish brick, and the birch trees, obviously, as they grow up. So we start to get a real sense of that Scandinavian idyll that Alan Reiach was interested in, and we still are. Next slide, and I'll hand over to Mark.
Thanks, Neil. I'll have to go at a wee bit of a clip just to get through the next slides. So that's effectively just picking up on where Neil left off. The building sort of finds its way to the southeast of the site and is pulled back from the public access routes to the south and the west to create the spaces for sort of dignified civic space in front of the building. We started the design of the Falkirk campus by looking back at the design of the Alloa and Stirling campuses and at the post-occupancy evaluation assessments that were done for both of those projects. And one of the interesting things that came out of that was that there was a tendency for some of the south-facing areas that were highly occupied to overheat and have a sort of poor indoor air quality at times. So that was one of the things that we tried to address with the design of the new campus. So in Alloa and Stirling, we had a suspended ceiling that was, wall to wall, and in Falkirk we tried to get access to the potential cooling capacity of the precast concrete floor slab to help iron out some of those peaks and troughs that we were experiencing in Alloa and Stirling. Another thing that we introduced was mechanical ventilation to the project as a mixed mode, so that we could still maintain the opening windows, but effectively have the boost of the mechanical system in the background on days when it was maybe a little bit still outside to help draw air through the building and keep comfort conditions. And then in winter, you can obviously close up and rely on the mechanical ventilation system with the benefit of that heat recovery and the energy benefits that brings with you. In terms of daylight, we've got a generous floor-to-floor height of 4 meters, and that allows us to have ceilings that are about 3.2 meters high, which gives a really nice feeling within the space, but also has the benefit of, because we've placed the glazing right up at ceiling level, it allows that deep daylight penetration into the back of the classroom spaces, which has allowed us to have a 7.5 meter deep classroom space, which sort of works also in terms of single-sided ventilation, where spaces need to be naturally ventilated. And then the lower section of the glazing, we're keen to maintain connections from inside to outside. So we placed the horizontal transom at 2 meters so that it wouldn't interrupt that kind of connection between the building and its environment. And then also at the lower level, we've introduced an 800 mil high sill, effectively because you don't get any benefit from glazing down to floor level in terms of the daylight factors within the room, but also it allows increased flexibility for the college. They can fit the internal classroom spaces out with putting benching at the walls if they need to. And then just in terms of the various different types of spaces in the building, we've got the teaching block off to the west, and that's creates these sheltered courtyard spaces that all the surrounding spaces feed into and enjoy the beneficial use of. On the right-hand side, you can see the facade strategy is using that handmade brick to get the texture, and also a white precast concrete element that masters each of the structural columns behind and setting up a rhythm, and then counterbalancing that rhythm by having these deep punched window reveals that are pulled right back deep into the room and create a sort of an element of self-shading, because this is a west elevation, so it kind of helps to augment that the shading strategy on that elevation. And then a different approach on the south elevation, where we've got the floor to ceiling height glazing on the public facing facades. So to help create that connection between the public facing elements of the building, we've got a 3.5 meter deep cantilevered precast concrete solar shading device that effectively means that we can pull off that trick of having full glazing without the downsides of unwanted solar gain. And then the workshop block, sort of in contrast to the materiality of the teaching block, we've got an extruded anodized aluminium cladding system that's used as a rain screen here, and the north elevation view, we've created that same 3.2 meter datum, but flipped it on its head so that the windows only happen above that datum on this building, allowing the college to fit out the workshop spaces as flexibly as they like, and bringing light in from a series of roof lights and clear story glazing. What we really like about the contrast between the rougher textured element of the teaching block and the smoother shininess, I guess, of the workshop block is the texture that brings. It almost looks like staining, but that's just a sort of visual aberration of the aluminium cladding system, creating these sort of lines, the streaks that change depending on the light conditions and the angle that you're viewing it at. So we really like that sort of almost drawing-like watercolor type effect that gives. And then inside the workshop blocks, using the roof lights again, lessons learned from Allo and Stirling, where we used the structural bracing zone within the roof lights that were kind of triangulated bracing zones. So the space between those bracing, we utilized that for dropping these really massive roof lights that are trapezoidal roof lights down and flooding those spaces with daylight. Then the sports block to the southwest of the site occupies a really important, prominent part of the site. It's got the sports facilities in it. It's things like hair and beauty, but also has social sciences as well as part of it. And obviously, these are all community use facilities that are arranged along that south face. And some of the sporting spaces with the teaching spaces associated with sport on the upper level there, connecting down into the spaces where sporting activities taking place, having a nice connection between those two things. And then the circulation routes are predominantly created by a north-south and an east-west axis, the black dotted lines there, linking the entrance to the north and the main entrance to the southeast. And along that line, to break up what is effectively a sort of 100-meter long route, we have these on the right-hand side. We've got carving the openings into that first floor and bringing top light down into the space. And then the circulation routes, we've sort of played a game with the schedule of accommodation in terms of borrowing space from the staff areas and taking that circulation route out of the staff space and by planning it more efficiently, and then transferring the area that we saved into areas where the students could actually make use of the space, like the circulation space on the right that gives different learning opportunities, all kind of punctuated with the roof light top lit spaces. And then the nodes of these circulation routes identify sort of our orientation devices, really, where we've got things like stairs and toilets always placed in the same place to aid navigation and make the plan quite legible. And then things like the refectory finds itself at the heart of those spaces. And on the right-hand side there, one of the breakout flexible learning spaces that opens off that particular space gives you a small scale sort of individual learning opportunity, and then other spaces like the Learning Resource Centre on the right open up and give you the potential for group activity. And then the ground floor there, what you can't quite see on this elevation is that there's a flexible learning space with a relocatable glazed partition that completely folds back. So you can have spaces that are anywhere from 80 square meters up to 1,000 square meters by reconfiguring those partitions. And then just carving holes into that floor plate and allowing connections from the activities that are happening at the ground floor, the cafe on the left-hand side, the LRC in the distance, and the entrance in the background. And then the staff admin spaces are arranged over 2 levels and have a hole cut in the center to increase communication between the staff. And the central space between that runs from north to south is arranged for the sort of general teaching spaces. These are bookable spaces that aren't assigned to any particular department. And again, that twist of 9 degrees allowed us to open up the circulation and carve those holes into the floor plate and allow generous amounts of top light down into the plan. This is on the right hand side. This is artist Stephen Alders, who we've worked with on quite a few projects like the National Archive in Wick and Maggie's Centre. And we really liked the fact that this painting is referencing a Rietveld interior. We just really liked the colour contrasts on that, and that's reflected in the back painted Valchromat, the back painted glass, and the Valchromat linings to the roof lights that we've brought through into the college. And then just making use of the circulation spaces. So even these sort of little eddy spaces that just branching off the circulation, getting beneficial use through that. And then the specialist highly serviced spaces like the labs and the science spaces are in this north-south spine, which is arranged directly beneath the main service plant spaces at roof level, just to shorten duct runs and make everything at them as efficient as possible. And bringing that through into the roof lights, we've really enjoyed playing with this roof light design. So we've got it associated effectively with all the circulation routes and all the kind of key spaces as a sort of motif that runs through the building. And again, that line idea, the drawn lines and the Valchromat on the left being reflected through into the sort of lined perforation, or the pattern that we've cast into the precast concrete on the outside, hopefully tying the inside and the outside together conceptually. And that's it for the presentation. Thank you very much.
Thank you both, Neil and Mark. And I think it's really amazing to see a presentation within 20 minutes that goes from the kind of narrative of the practice right down to the details of the building. So thank you very much for managing to squeeze that in. It was great. And I'd just like to hand over now to Alan Garland from Stallan-Brand to take us through Jedburgh Grammar Campus. Over to you, Alan.
Thanks, Christina. That's a hard act to follow. It was a great looking project, guys. I'll share my screen. There we go. Oops. Oh, oops. So this is so Jedburgh Intergenerational Community Campus was the original name of the project. And this here's a piece of artwork that we did as part of the Venice Biennale work. We did at the same time, talking about a sort of free space, a space where young people find their own ways to learn. And that was a sort of theme the practice is really quite passionate about. And as we go through the presentation, these are the sort of images that are the shots that come out at the end of the project. The shots you take is the professional photographs and go through, and this is the sort of main entrance and the sort of community plaza space within it, and how the building reaches out into these spaces to welcome you into the area. And you can see the palette of materials have kept it very simple, and there's a sort of rain screen, GRC cladding and curtain walling, and a very simple banding arrangement of the design. And one of the key ideas is sort of nestling it into the landscape. It's the Scottish borders. It's a wonderful landscape of rolling hills, and try to be part of that landscape for a large building. Try to ingrain that into the natural setting that it was. So that's the external sort of main key shots that has been promoted, and then internally this is a sort of key sort of space, which is the information plaza. When you walk in, it's a space that's not really the Scottish Borders Council or authority don't really have a space like this. It's a sort of communal large volume space. It's not really a dining room like many schools have. It's a more community focused space, which I'll pick up a little later. And that's a lot looking in the other direction, where it has the classic Keller upstairs in many schools and brings you up into the space for this. And it's a very community focused school, and it's slightly different from many of the other community campuses that's been done there. So I try to really innovate within that space. And this just looks in it. You can see in the right-hand side, the main information plaza on the left, some of the teaching spaces break out onto this open plan onto it. And there's this idea of this community, they can access these facilities within the space. So idea of this all being connected and visual throughout it. And then this look at some of the teaching spaces where we try to make this as an actual classroom, but try to break the mold from the traditional classroom. So this is somewhere where maybe individual study, or small group study, or discussion, debate points, or even part of each of the year groups have a space that's theirs to combine. So really, one of the ethos when we go through this is that it's about trying to change or trying to review particularly the senior phase of education. And then this again is a paired classroom space, which is open onto the breakout. So we really try to break the model down in the sort of the enclosed spaces that we've seen in many schools. And this would be the science lab that looks at a kind of cluster arrangement rather than individual labs. It takes 3 labs and converts a super lab arrangement with demonstration beds and different types of furniture, and really try to make it a standing workshop type environment rather than sit and chop and talk. STEM lab, again, just bringing in different technology and the kind of combination of different education modes. And for us, this project allowed us to look at 3 key kind of aspects of the architecture practice. I think the practice are quite are very interested in, and it's the place. As that said, the place. What makes a building? How do we ingrain the place? Community. Part of the work with this client, the Scottish Borders Council, is about flipping the dynamic of their estate. And one of the sayings was, this isn't a school that community get access to. This is a community building that the school use. So the idea that this is a community focused space, and that's part of that intergenerational chat. And that leads on to the next one is learner journey. The school, or this space, this building, was supposed to be the lifelong learning. 2 to 102 was the sort of description. This is what it's tended to be used for. In the centre place, so Scottish Borders, Jedburgh is located down just north of the southern uplands. Down here, and it's a rich landscape of rolling hills and historic, almost ancient towns nestled in there, with some real grand structures that cross through the valleys, and a beautiful rolling landscape. The history of Jedburgh was formed, founded around about the 9th century. We look back to what was there to understand where it's going to go. And we look at, that's the site here of it, and you can see through, the older maps, how it's a market town. As it expands across the water, it starts to more of the new developments over in the last 50, 60 years of the sort of post-war expansion of housing. But the town itself was quite stable for quite sort of compact, and as it expanded across, and this site here formed, I've jumped into people. So one of the key things obviously is people, and the Jedburgh culture has got a rich, very, very unique Jedburgh culture to it, and it's a community that's tight. It's quite remote from everywhere else in terms of there's no real reason to go to Jedburgh. It's got a route to England, but it's in its own little town, a little space within this rolling hills, with an ancient history and a rich culture, and also it suffered from that sort of rural decline. The textile industry down here was very big, and then when it left, the sort of towns found that difficult to recover. So it's got that kind of rural deprivation element to it as well. So when they bring this new facility to Jedburgh, it's a once in a generation, once in a lifetime, for this town. And that's something that really resonates about how we deliver this, and trying to focus something that really serves the people, an asset that's there to be used by everyone, and not just that 9 till 3:30 and it's a closed off asset. This is a sort of overall map of it. And so the historic town is over here, with the Jedwater that runs right through the middle, with the historic town, the historic high street, running right through the middle, with the old castle at the top of it. The residential spaces that expand across the river was a sort of post-war across here, and then there's this gap site in the middle with some of the industrial work, the main work areas up at the top of the hill here. And as you look at the site, you think that's good prime development land, but the site selection on it, it's a very difficult site. It's a 40-metre change in level from the bottom to the top. So it's got a huge infrastructure challenge on it, and to put a school in here is quite different from most approaches authorities. The Scottish Borders have done many schools where they put it out of town and they put it at a flat site, a greenfield site, and they've done that before, but it doesn't really work for them. They feel that they want to invest within the town, within the townscape, to keep that locality in it, and particularly with the ethos of this school, of this community-focused space, this intergenerational campus. It's 3 to 18. They want it knitted in the town, so they decided to build on what is a very challenging infrastructure site. And you can see here, it's a greenfield site. It's not been developed within any of the records. It's a good. It's the right size, but that 40-metre change from right down to here, right up to the top of the hill where the factories are, was a significant challenge with no road access. A dirt old path along there with it's a historical driveway with 150-year-old trees that go along it. So we had to navigate through that for a road. But as you can see, it's a beautiful landscape that's setting in. The views that you get along there and over the hills was stunning. You know, it was one of those dream sites you get given. And you can see within the town, it's a 10-metre town, 10-minute town. Everything's within that 10-metre walking distance. It's all very compact, and the population is roughly about 3,500 people. And the 2 primary schools, one over here and one down here, and the high school there, is all very compact in that town. So that was part of the ethos, is to keep that delivery within the central space. And we tested some really early feasibility options, because obviously the infrastructure and how that's going to work within there was something we had to test the variety of various options through there. So the learning environment. So when the client came to us with the sort of, let's do an intergenerational 3 to 18 campus, we're like, you know, what's the brief? And their first question, point was, let's put the scheduled accommodations, the ACRs, all the requirements we've done for the previous PFI and the previous SFT funded schools, let's put that to the side. Let's start from scratch. Let's think about what are we trying to deliver here in terms of education. And they wrote a paper. So the paper was the bidding paper, and I'm not going to read through all the lines there, but essentially they wrote these as this is the brief of what you want to deliver. Go and come back to us with what you want to do. And there's a space where the talents, abilities and skills of everyone in the community is brought together for the benefit of all. A space where education is for everyone at every stage of their life. And the Scottish Borders works to enhance the quality of life, make best use of public resources, and ensure that continuous improvement services. The council aims to strengthen Jedburgh as a learning town where children and people of all ages can grow and learn together, where education is embedded within the character and quality of the place. So that's all they gave us, essentially, to say, go and look at what this can be. So we started to work up diagrams and work up ideas of what it can be, and it fell into sort of 3 circles of 3 like spheres. You had the education, so that was a vehicle for delivery of this. You have the community aspect, so they wanted the facility to be open like a community centre or a sports centre, so you could walk in at any point in the day, and the spaces that are there for the school can be used by the community within there. And then they looked at enterprise. How could we facilitate the growth of the smaller businesses or the business within there to bring training opportunities for the young people, and also facilitate enterprise within there? If someone's working in a small business within their home, they can come here and use this as small enterprise. So trying to really flip what this asset can do for a community and make it key to it. And as I said, sweat every asset. So all the assets, look at what we have in here and make them do as much as they possibly can to give as much back to the community as possible. This year, if anyone does schools on the call, will know what the SFT metric is. I'm not going to give everyone a lecture on that, don't worry. But it's essentially understanding that the whole building is delivered under that metric. So the amount of pupils essentially generates what is a floor area, and then the floor area has a cost. And the cost ultimately works out as the funding envelope for the school. And that's how it's all worked out. So we delivered this within that metric space. And the SFT promote certain examples of the sort of classic finger plan, which is kind of the PFI feel, of what it was. And then you've got the super block arrangement of that. And, from our analysis on that is that, and also the discussion with the client, is that when you particularly look at the early years and you look at the primary, they've moved on in terms of the curriculum, but becoming the senior phase, there is still a propensity to do, classroom after classroom after classroom, chalk and talk, 30 kids facing a board, and that sort of put the cellularization of space, and you create this warehouse of just putting kids within this space for such a period of time and it just creates this departmental boxes. So we didn't want to do that. We want to do this, which was a space which engages with pupils, which brings the life and where people want to be in. and it's a part of that community space where it encourages pupils to engage in their own learning. And then we think about what do you need to learn? You know, school and education, that's the vehicle, it's the key component of it. It's a broad spectrum. It's not just what results you get at the end. To make the holistic, rounded pupil, the super pupil, you need to bring that whole aspect to it. And we're trying, and also it's not as much anymore about chalk and talk, it's about trying to create the critical thinkers, looking at different pedagogies and looking at how you can educate more than just that one mono pedagogy, which is primarily associated with 30 tables and chairs, focusing at the board, the sort of cells and bells. And from most people in the call, I imagine, in my sort of journey through school, there is this sort of pre-primary, you know, you may have done something, and then it's all the primaries all the way up, and then it's secondary all the way up, and it's each box. You jump in each of the silos. But the curriculum of excellence, and we actually read the curriculum of excellence and went through it and started that idea of this is where you build a brief from. You look at through the curriculum of excellence, and they've built this learner, the stages, the learner journey through the stages, where you group the stages together to minimise the transitions. And as a 3 to 18 campus within a closed community almost, which is a sort of static population, that seemed like a very, very clear way of starting to build up this idealised curriculum of excellence layout, where you take the learner journeys. If you go through it, if you go through you're sort of through the process, understanding that a nursery pupil or early years pupil is completely different than where they learn from a senior phase, and think of how you create the houses of the different stages through the journey, and then bring the things that can be shared across it, and then create the sort of shared social space in between it. And then looking at that as part of that learning landscape. So creating the whole landscape that ties it all together as part of that inside-outside arrangement. And then organisation in terms of, you know, you find this very siloed approach, particularly to the senior phase, is what we find is what's an interesting aspect we like to challenge on it. So usually you've got your departments, you've got your art, you've got your math, you've got all your different subjects, but the cross collaboration between them doesn't happen because they're so siloed. So there was an idea that instead of having it as departments, is taking what you can out of that and creating it more as a non-departmental model. So it's an age model, so more akin to each of the learner stages. So you've got maths is taught within the stage cluster rather than in a specific department. And then when we flip back to the townscape, you know, as I say, the Scottish Borders has this rich tapestry of space, of ruins, you know, that's Hume Castle, which is, you know, stunning, sits on the hilltop. And then you have, you know, various different aspects, particularly in Jedburgh, you have the ruinous abbey that sits there, and you have these towns that are nestled within it. And we're really trying to pick up those themes within it, within the design of it. And you're on, when you look at, you know, up the hill, the 40-metre change in level, how do we look at how we blend in that journey with up that area, that space, and the idea of layers and platforms and tectonics started to influence how we thought about the design of the school. This is the site plan, obviously, it sits here. So the school building sits within this location here. It sits approximately 20 metres up the hill. So from this area here, you're talking approximately 20 metres up the sort of journey up to the area. We looked at how that whole aspect works in terms of making sure it was a sort of, you know, a journey that would be part of the experience to the school and to the community plaza that's at the stop, almost like an extension of the high street. So the high street's over the other side of the water, but you come up, you have this almost community high street within there. And then you have various sort of drop-off and car parking, the main entrance to the school, and then you have drop-off buses, car park over this location, and then you have got the hockey pitch and the 3G pitch along here, with the different age groups having the different spaces externally within the early years, within the primary, and then as you go up the hill, you have the next platform, which is the secondary school. So essentially cutting platforms into the hillside to fit this within it. This gives you a three-dimensional aspect of it. So we have that journey up from the main body of the town through there, and then you have the various different playgrounds again, and then the learning plaza within that space, and the big section cutting right through. So the idea being that the landscape transitioned as we went through it. So coming through the sort of historic driveway and that sort of more wilder, more, you know, larger bushed landscape spaces up as you journey up, and then it gets more refined and more manicured to a certain degree around where we're at the school. And then you have one large retaining wall with the building sat in there, so you nestle it in the hillside with the pitches then dropped in the top of it. So the idea of knitting it into that site section. This is a sort of model that looks at this sort of idea of these plateaus and transition through it. So you can see it's really essentially 2 to 3 platforms as it steps up the hill. So then this is how we then broke down the program of it. So we talked about that, you know, how to create how to create a community aspect, and then how to create different learner zones within there. So we had the accommodation brief. We sort of subdivided it to say that some of the education spaces are more private, so they're more about general purpose education. And then there's spaces that are opportunity for the community to use or to be shared between the different age groups. So we split it down 2 legs, and then we put the high street, essentially, put the central learning plaza through the middle, and then connected that into the landscape at the different levels through there as it stepped up the hill. And then there's extensive environmental modelling on this, looking at the aspect and the daylighting. It's a deep plan building, how to ensure the daylighting is driven into, you know, the heart of that space, and also ensure that the thermal gains, solar gains within there are minimised within what we have is quite large aspects of glazing. And this is the sort of the axonometric, giving you an idea. So it's almost like the joke was, it's almost like the sausage machine, is that you bring in the early years at the front, and as you move through each of the different learner zones, they transition to come up to the final one, which is the most senior face up the top. And then you have through the middle this information plaza, as we described it, through the middle. And then you have the most shared spaces. So within there's agile workspaces. So out of class time, we made more of an agile space within there. And then you've got some of the dining facilities, but keeping that off of this information plaza, keep it off this central space so it can be used for something slightly different, more as a community street. We've got enhanced provision as well within there, and nestling the main halls in the back. So that's where the retaining wall is. That's within the hillside, almost, with the facilities and changing within it. So then on the main sort of education side of it, you have the early years nursery, which then blends onto P1 and P2 with direct access to the external. And then as you go up the plan, you have the additional primary spaces, more upper primary, which then leads on to your S1, S2. So part of the idea was that the transition, one of the key benefits of the 318 model is that transition from primary school to secondary school doesn't exist. So it's seamless through the whole building. And then with more of the art and the other more shared facilities to the other side of the street, they'll be open to the community. And then as you go up to the next floor, you have the science, CDT, and the upper secondary school spaces in there. We have direct breakout into their external spaces up there with that street that connects right through the middle of the plan. And part of the sort of try and be the innovation within it is that over the time we've worked in various different classroom typologies, and we've went from the sort of enclosed classrooms with the breakout outside, so essentially a corridor that's slightly wider that gives an opportunity for different learning environment. And then we've worked in, you know, ones where we've taken away the doors and made that sort of semi-enclosed teaching space that gives you better access to the breakout. But on this one, we tried to do something slightly different on it. So as we've had these age-specific studio clusters, we tried to make it more of a studio feel to it. So this would be an example of a eight classroom cluster arrangement. So that's essentially 8 classrooms where we look at how these teaching spaces can be paired, can be enclosed, can be the variety of different furnitures within it to allow the transition between the spaces to try and provide that alternative learning space, alternative group interactions within it, and also some practical light space within there. So some of the practical spaces, you can do some of the lighter practical sides of some of maybe science or food technology within this learning cluster within there to augment those briefed areas, and then looking at a teaching space as a student workspace or rebranding it. But it is essentially a classroom, but you may go there to do something different from you would do within the closed space. So it's back to that sort of idea of the pedagogy of how the teaching methodology would be operated, providing the variety within the teaching base. This is sort of axonometric of it, of cutting through. We have some of the teaching clusters here with the voids between it for natural light and ventilation into the heart of the plan, and then you have more of these practical bases of double classrooms along here overlooking the central atrium and the hell upstairs, and then the public side of it, which is the practical spaces over there. In terms of the architecture, I think we were keen to bring that the idea of community and the idea of a democratic architecture, so not the block, expand it out, reach out, bring and inhabit the building as much as we can. So you're inside before you get to the door. And it's to take away the idea of that confined, industrial school, and make it that kind of that generous, that reaching out architectural experience. And and that's actually a Frank Lloyd Wright quote, it's the idea of being part of the hill, of being part of that space, and bringing the idea of the tectonics and the rock forms within the school, and just trying to, almost like the hill's been scraped back and expose these tectonic plates, that then becomes part of the architecture within there. This is just one of the initial sort of idea of this reaching out aspect of the school. Just the elevations, just thought I'd make sure to put them in with the banding that runs across there, and then some roof forms accent the roof space. And as I said, it was a rain screen cladding, curtain walling banding around the base, and then the roof, it's got these roof cannons that draw light into that central atrium space. And the breakdown would be these copper coloured roof lights, then with a sort of masonry banding was the initial idea within it. And then ribbons of curtain walling that wrap around it, which sit within this tiering of the landscape space. And this was a planning visualization as we submitted it, and that was the final visual. No, sorry, that was not the visual, that was the photograph of the completed building, no visual. And just a couple of statistics on it, just because I've not focused particularly on the environmental aspect of it, but there was quite a lot of work to look at how we drive. This was a Pathfinder project for SFT in terms of looking at the energy strategy on it, and part of that was to drive down the U values. So we got the U values down to the sort of baseline passive house numbers for the walls, roofs and the floors, but the windows we kept to the 1.2, and their tightness target remained at a sort of 5. Generally because the contractor, it was new ground in terms of pushing that any further with that, and there was an A-rated building with the EPC, the SBM calc coming out about 77 kilowatt hours. So the new target is 67, so it would be within that band A on theory, but the SBM calc's not the best. There's also a thank you at the end, and if I give me a sec, I was going to show this as well. So this here gives you a sort of flavour of it, and it's an animation of the end of the job. So this is quite close to the completed project, but it gives you a real flavour of the sense of this arrival, this idea of this community space that you don't buzz to get in. You walk in this space and you come in, and the idea being that you would be maybe a parent, and that idea of the outreach, that you come in, you maybe drop your pupil, your kid at nursery, and then you can go and do a yoga class within the games hall. So it is a community asset that's open to the public, as you would be any community building. And the idea, you come in and you have clear definition between primary and spaces you can't go, and then you have obviously clear control at the front door. But then the spaces off this central community plaza, there's the idea it was a street and there were shop fronts. So public library is moving here. There's a space for enterprise, so small businesses coming in and using this space as possibly or artists using this space within there. There's a student cafe for the students to run this a cafe for the pupils, to serve the pupils, and then dining areas off there. So the idea is, a member of the public, you can come in here and get a school dinner. You can be an elderly person coming in. That's the idea of the intergenerational. You come in here and do a class, and you can also come in here and be part of this space, part of this community at any point in the day. Is the idea we have it. And then you can see the sort of music spaces and the science spaces at the top are on the left hand side, on that northern side of the plan, which is for that access element. So the community has the opportunity of using the CDT, the men's shed movement, or using the music or the recording studio, using what was a cook school, which we branded in here, which is a higher spec solution, more akin to the sort of Great British Bake Off was the design concept of the client. And then as we move through, we have the sort of design studios for the textiles, which are all open to this information plaza. With breakout in different areas, different spaces without there. And then as you move into the sort of last one is the art department has this great view. It's the best view in the building that overlooks the entire sort of the valley and the mature trees in the distance. Internally, the aesthetic was all very much exposing, being an honest building, so exposing the steelwork and allowing everything to just about touch but not quite, and try to keep that separation of the structure, the walls, architecture, the lights, the balustrades, the finishes, just to create a slight separation between all the aspects within there, and it overlooks this sort of central space within the plaza. And I think that just ends right about there. And I think that's me. And I'll probably hand back over to Christina.
Fantastic. Thank you very much, Alan. It was really interesting. I was quite mesmerized by that visualization, having visited the building. It's actually, there's an element of understanding and reality there. So I feel that you gave us a whistle-stop tour. So thank you to all of our speakers this evening. I think it's quite hard to present a building, in 20, 25 minutes and actually get across what it takes to produce an educational building of this scale. And I suppose something that jumped out to me as a judge for the RIAS Awards is that actually a lot of it's to do with the client. And one thing that jumped out from both projects is that the client seemed to have an attitude of either learning what went before, which was an example, obviously shown in Forth Valley College, or, not always doing what was done before in terms of Scottish Borders Council. So I'd really like to come, to both parties in terms of, how much did that really influence your work in terms of having a client that actually wanted to fight for the important elements of the design and not have every element value engineered out, and really kind of feel that you were on the same page. Neil, I'll come to you first and then Alan.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, Alan. Enjoyed that. You absolutely hit the nail on the head. I mean, the client is just, oops, sorry about that. An ambulance going past. Absolutely critical. But I think, well, in a sense, I think I mentioned it, but I think what's really vital about the client was their goal wasn't a building. Their goal was the best they could do for their staff and their students. And we don't often meet that kind of ambition. And I'll be frank, particularly in university buildings, where the onus might be on research, or it might be on image, or it might be on something else. But what we do get from our college projects, from Glasgow College and all our, we're working on Fife at the moment, is the absolute desire to give their students the best facilities they can, working within the strictures that we're all aware of. And I think what that means is that we've got to, Mark mentioned it, we've got to box pretty cleverly actually to get beyond the metrics, to try and to eke out space, and particularly space that's not briefed, and we know that it's the space that's not briefed that actually is the space that give a building its character, possibly, or its life. So, and I don't know, Mark, but Forth Valley were incredibly supportive. And we've got to remember that because we were working for them for 15 years over 3 campuses, it wasn't the same person across them, but they all bought into this notion of let's do the best we can. So yeah, I would agree with you.
I think what was really fascinating with Forth Valley College was it's the best architectural brief I think I've ever read. It was 40 pages long. And usually with public procured buildings, you get that awful PQQ document that's so anodyne that you can't work anything out in terms of the ambition. But it was really clear that the college had put a huge amount of thought into what they wanted before they engaged with design teams. And it was a lovely brief in that it wasn't in any way prescriptive. They hadn't come to any preconceived notions. They just, as Neil was saying, they just had ideas about quality of space, about light, about air, about, inclusivity. And it was quite refreshing actually to have that. Quite often it's the strangest things, but sometimes some clients that you work with really are on the periphery of the design process, and maybe it's through a cautiousness or a sort of underconfidence, but they were right at the heart of it, and it was probably one of the best clients I've ever worked with, to be honest.
Just as a little aside, sorry, Anne, I know you want to get him in, is that what was interesting both about Forth Valley and Glasgow College was that there were senior architects involved in the briefing. So Gordon Murray was involved in Forth Valley and setting an agenda for the college to understand. Henry McEwen was involved hugely on the Glasgow College and almost wrote a parallel brief, which was about ambition, space, light, materials, those kind of things, as well as this, as you said, Mark, that anodyne numbers thing. So yeah, I think the RIAS and its members and as part of the briefing team is really critical.
That's really interesting. And Alan, just before I come to you, I realised that we were meant to finish at 6:30, but if anyone's ever been to an event where I've been involved, I tend to talk, and I don't want to lose the opportunity with the expertise we have in the room to ask a couple of questions, and we have a few in the Q&A chat as well. So if it's okay, I'm going to run a little bit over to take advantage of who we have in the room here and the opportunity we have for a quick chat. I hope that's okay with the panelists and of course attendees. If you have to go, I'm very sorry for running over, but if you can stay, please do. So over to you, Alan. Same question. Sorry if you.
No, I'll keep mine quite short. I think a lot of things just that Neil mentioned there, I think I would agree with in terms of the start of it. I think we didn't have a brief. I think that's where they came to us saying that we're not happy with what we've had before. We want to do something different. Our procurement route was through the sort of hub process, which has got maybe a bad reputation historically from it. But I think the briefing that they gave them was to allow us to develop a design, take a journey directly with a client, and everyone bought into this process. And having that, how to put, direct relationship and almost writing the brief hand in hand with the client allowed us, as we went through the whole D&B and V and contractors and how the journey, the 3-year journey through the process allowed you to stand there and defend, having faith that they knew the client had asked specifically and had the belief in what you're going to deliver. So that's probably what I was saying. The clients, and within there was very few. The client, the Scottish Borders, is quite a small client. It's not a huge body, and there's an architect who Martin Joyce. He was the head of estates at the time, and he had sort of he helped guide some of that within there. But in terms of the education side, they were the real drivers. They set that agenda, and yeah, that was it.
I find that fascinating, and I think there's a few things to take from all of that. And I think the main thing is that, you know, having an architect involved in that briefing process, whether it's in advance, as you said, Neil and Mark, or whether it's an integral part of that project, I think that's key. And if I'm honest, as someone who didn't know anything about the projects, visiting them, you see that. And not in terms of aesthetic, you see that in terms of value. And I think that that's really, really critical. And Neil, not to quote you, but the eke out the space that wasn't briefed, that's the value. And I think that, you know, it shines through in both projects, if I'm honest. And, you know, not to be overly personal about it, but when I went to both projects, I'd never been in spaces like it as educational buildings. I mean, Jedburgh Grammar, we were shown around by a head teacher who was oozing more enthusiasm than one could imagine, you know, and it was almost emotional to see younger generations learning in spaces like that. And then moving through to the kind of, you know, the college and later higher education, you know, the facilities and the optimism and the degree of aspiration, I think, that the spaces characterize, it was just incredible, and a long way from the dusky dark corridors of closed doors that I was used to as a child, you know. And I think that that shows how far we've come, but also how far we can go, and the importance of the, you know, the profession in that journey. And I think a really key aspect of that, which rings through the kind of research thread that we're talking about, that goes through that briefing, Chris Stewart has picked up in a question that was actually directed at Alan, but I think cuts across both projects a little bit, in terms of there have been different forms of classrooms looked at through both projects. You know, have they been tested? Have they been well received? And will the schools kind of measure these, so that the college measure these going forward? And I think Forth Valley, you know, for the Forth Valley that had the benefit of learning from the two projects before, I suppose, Alan, from your perspective in terms of that testing, I'll come to you first. How do you see that? Are you recording feedback from the school? Are you using it in future projects? How's that working?
Yeah, so we're working on the next, it's more a high school run, 3 to 18 with the Scottish Borders, a couple actually, and there has been feedback directly from it. And I think Chris is right in a many ways. There's a radicalness to the kind of the layout that we deployed within here, and I probably probably a bit unopen, and to be quite, maybe in hindsight, maybe a little bit too open. There's been a little bit of feedback about a couple, maybe probably one too many open classrooms rather than one more closed classroom, just with some issues in terms of privacy, noise a little bit, but acoustically we've worked really hard to get to work. And it was about a little bit of breaking the mold, and it's a bit of a test bed, I have to admit, and the client was so keen for that it gave me some sleepless nights as much as everyone else. But the feedback's positive in general, but there is a couple of niggles, to be quite honest, and a wee bit, maybe a little bit too open, and that's something we refine for the next one.
That's really interesting. Sorry, same question, Neil and Mark.
Well, maybe I'll go off on a tangent here. I'll try and risk it, see what happens. We're working on a wee museum at Kilmartin, and we're working with archaeologists there. And there was, you know, how there's sometimes a moment when somebody says something that it's so obvious, and you just think, I haven't thought about that before. And what he said to me was, we were talking about signage and stuff, you know, Stone Age, Bronze Age, something else, you know, aluminium, microchip age. And he said, that is just purely to allow people to get a handle on time. The reality is we're still in the Stone Age. We're still in the Bronze Age. So what he's really saying is that an age doesn't finish, it is less important. I think we're going back into the Stone Age architecturally in terms of sustainability of local materials. So material that was once thought to be ancient and irrelevant is now relevant again. So the Stone Age never disappeared. And the reason I'm saying that is that the classroom, it's not about saying that classroom form is not relevant anymore. It's relevant in certain circumstances. And I think that's what Alan's sort of suggesting, yes, is what we're adding to it is another vocabulary of open plan or blended spaces. But the singular classroom where somebody closes the door, sometimes the college needs that. It needs that privacy, it needs that acoustic separation. So it's not about saying, all right, we've left that behind, we're on to something else. It's about bringing that with new ideas, or maybe not new ideas, different ways of meeting, learning. And it's having the skill, I think, in the plan to generate all of those options for the staff so that they can say, this is why I need to take these students, say you're in a primary school, we need to take this little group away to a quiet place to help them with the reading or something. So my attitude would be, it's not either or, it's both, if that makes sense.
Neil, I'm going to use that. Neil, that was great.
But I think it's really, you're completely right. I mean, we're always looking to find that new solution, but at the end of the day, when we look at the way we probably all practice in this room, you always look back before you look forward. And I think it's a really interesting thing in terms of pedagogy and learning as well. And I think one of the biggest things across both projects is that it recognizes that everyone is different and everyone learns in different ways. And I think that that's a really refreshing element. And I suppose the transparency that runs through both projects is really to be admired in that respect. And there's a really interesting observation as an architect, having visited both projects, is that there's not really a back to any of them. And I found that fascinating. And the fact that it's both is even more fascinating, in the fact that, you know, Jedburgh beds itself into the hill in such a clever way to bury, you know, the enormous sports hall in the kind of right at the kind of back of the building, and use that space, you know, very innovative in terms of just actually how you draw that section, but also that when you get up to the top, which you would think would be the back of the building, is actually that secondary platform where you can interact, which is really clever. And the materiality continues, you've got the views. And then at Forth Valley Campus, you go around what you think will be the back, which is where you see the workshops, and the materiality changes, the landscape changes, you've got that corridor connection, and it's almost like the building is playing with you as you're moving around, you know, and it's got a different beauty to it. I suppose, was that intentional in both projects? Or I'm sorry, I'm not trying to trick anyone here. Was it just kind of responding to site conditions?
from my point of view, it was a building in the rounds, and they tried to value engineer the change in material, but it was a case of it was, you're right, it was about that language of the sort of the rockscape, the rock forms coming out the hillside, and try to maintain that tectonic concept through the architecture. And it was a case of, you can see it from all sides. It's in a beautiful landscape. There's not a back and a front. The kids deserve at the back of the playground the same experience at the front of it. And it was that idea of one simple material, one simple banding, one simple arrangement to knit it together. So from my point of view, was we stuck our heels in and was not changing. That was the concept. Yep.
Thanks, Alan. Over to you, Mark and Neil.
Will I jump in, Mark?
Yeah.
There's an aspect I'm kind of interested in this, because I think that's what makes working on colleges really interesting, is that when you talk about back and front, you somehow give it some sort of value. That the front is more important than the back. So you're sort of saying it's better than the back or something like that. And what I think is really interesting about college projects is you are dealing with an organization that values everybody's role. So the service yard is actually as interesting as the front door. The front door is just doing another job, but the guys that are working in the service yard are actually, that could be the construction industries have spilled out there and they're mixing concrete and building or supplying bricks or whatever. So, or it's guys going into the sports hall. So what's lovely about, I think, all of these college projects is that they really value what the student is doing. So there isn't a back and a front from that perspective, that their back is equally as important to the boardroom or whatever that area is. So it's an interesting one, because I think you're right. In at Falkirk, we were in a situation where all elevations were visible. So I don't know if I explained myself very well there, but that's what I enjoy about the college projects, is there's no value brought by the college on what somebody's doing. They're all equal, whether you're a brickie or a beautician or a learning computer science or whatever. I don't know if you would agree, Mark.
Yeah, I mean, that was sort of embedded in the first conversations that we had, where they didn't want a student walking to the workshop to feel a drop in quality. So they wanted everybody that was working or studying there to feel valued in exactly the same way. So it was a really clear message that they communicated to us, that they wanted the same attention that was given to the more traditional teaching spaces to flow right through the circulation and into the kind of vocational spaces too.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and I think that's really fast. It speaks to the value, I think, that we were looking at before, in terms of the client interaction and what both practices have brought to the projects, in terms of, let's be honest, in terms of value engineering, you normally end up with a back of house whether you want one or not.
Yeah.
The servicing normally gets pushed to we've all been through that process, and to have overcome that, I think, that's why they're both RIAS award-winning projects. Congratulations to both practices, as both projects are on the Doolan Award shortlist this year as well. And it's moments like that that count, and it does affect how a building functions. So we don't have any more questions, but I'm gonna just ask you both to kind of leave us with something, in that both projects kind of look at things a little bit differently in terms of how educational buildings are procured. Could you leave us with one thought in terms of the procurement for education buildings going forward? Obviously, that's a total drop bombshell, but a short summary in terms of off the top of your head, if you could change one thing about how that's been procured in Scotland, what would you do? And I'll come to Mark and Neil first, and then Alan second.
Do you got any thoughts, Mark?
Well, I mean, what was interesting about the way that Falkirk was procured was it was slightly different to the first two. So Alloy and Stirling were two-stage design and build, which had its challenges because the contractor just prices on overhead and profit for the first stage to be selected, and then the second stage is usually where the kind of painful stuff happens, where all the V&E VE exercises happen because there's problems with the budget. And you have to collaborate and work hard with the contractor, but you also have to really fight your corner in those situations to try and maintain any kind of quality. At Falkirk, it was slightly different, and we engineered a situation where it was a single stage design and build. It was originally supposed to be an NPD project, actually, but it ran aground with the European procurement rules, and as the NPD process was kind of scrapped. So it became a single stage D&D where we designed it to really quite a high level. So we did almost a traditional amount of tender documentation, sort of 1 to 5 details. We designed everything that we cared about and everything that could be seen or touched. And all of the sort of room layouts were done by us prior to tendering. And then we stayed client side after that. And we handed it over to the construction team, and that's where Balfour Beatty and Kepi Design came in. And Kepi's acted as the delivery architect to facilitate what was a relatively well-advanced design. And I have to say, I think that worked really well. Kepi's did a fantastic job at doing the hard graft of working through the details with the various subcontractors. And us sitting client side, were able to sort of make sure that the original design intent was followed through into the building, and there is a sort of actually just as advice quite a lot of the times with Kepi's, where they said, you know, how should this be finished off? And I think it was just a really good collaborative process. So out of the 2 different ways of doing things, I would say the second way was an awful lot better.
That's really interesting. Thanks, Mark. And how about yourself, Alan, in terms of going forward and how we procure educational buildings?
Well, I think something that we find generally, I think the way that we work with the Scottish Borders client is there's a bit of continuity in terms of done a couple of projects with them, and they don't open it out too much in terms of that ITT PQQ type, you know, bidding. We find when we bid for these campuses on that type of format, that the quality is essentially irrelevant to what we put in for the bid, and it really just comes down to buying out a fee. And something as a practice we've been a wee bit campaigning about in terms of when the local authorities are putting these out, to really think about what you're actually trying to do here in terms of bringing in quality and not just get somebody to buy it at a price. And we find that it was very unsuccessful in terms of, you know, we win quality and get just absolutely demolished at the cost point. And the Scottish Borders use a sort of framework, and I think if I was an education client, I would say you want to get your architect there directly with your team to write your brief with you, to really understand what you're all trying to get out of it. And then whatever procurement route goes down, we work with hubs, we've done D&Bs direct, we've done all various different ways. That relationship is what galvanizes the quality in a project. The procurement route's there to deliver a project, but your communication doesn't mean you have to go through 30 project managers and QSs to get to talk to your client. That relationship and direct communication should always be part of that journey. So you know what you want in the priorities, and that's what delivers strong projects, rather than other clients we work with. And it's a process driven. There's your shared accommodation. Essentially, contractor communicates, and we don't have that grain about what they want out of the project. And I think that's probably the lessons I take from these things.
It's really fascinating. I think there's a lot to, you know, for the RS to take away from that as well. Also, hopefully clients watching and architects as well, in terms of just what we can learn from those comments. And I just want to thank all of our panelists tonight, Mark, Neil and Alan, for joining us. It's been fascinating. I am sorry for overrunning, but we don't get many opportunities like this to talk about educational buildings, and we don't often get to exemplar projects like these. So thank you so much for giving up your evening to come and talk to us. It's really appreciated. If anyone does have any questions after the talks this evening, please do email them through to the RIAS, and we will forward them on to the practices and try to get them answered for you. That's not a problem at all. And thank you so much to the RIAS team for putting on the event tonight. Thank you also to our audience for joining us and for staying with us over time. Hopefully it was worth it. So thank you so much, everyone, for this evening. Enjoy your weekend when it comes, and thank you for joining us. Thanks again to our panelists as well. Thanks, everyone. Have a good
Thank you.
evening. Bye.